In the shadowed corridors of power where loyalty is currency and secrets are weapons, one man's discovery would shake the very foundations of the British royal family. What he found hidden in a forgotten file would expose decades of careful manipulation, revealing how the memory of a beloved princess had been systematically erased by those who feared her lasting influence. The rain pelted against the tall windows of Clarence House as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his security badge and stepped through the employee entrance. 23 years of service to the royal family had taught him that Tuesday mornings were usually quiet affairs, with most of the senior staff attending their weekly briefings. As head of palace security operations, Thomas had clearance to areas that most people could only dream of accessing. But today felt different somehow. The corridors seemed unusually empty as he made his way toward the administrative wing. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floors, creating a rhythm that matched his steady heartbeat. Thomas had always prided himself on being observant, a skill that had served him well in his previous career with Scotland Yard before joining the royal household. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. Earlier that morning, he had received an unusual request from the Deputy Private Secretary to retrieve some archived personnel files from the secure storage room. The request itself wasn't strange, but the specific files mentioned seemed oddly random. Names of former staff members who had left the royal household over the past 15 years, all categorized under routine resignations or early retirements. Thomas had worked alongside many of these individuals, and their sudden departures had always struck him as peculiar. Though he had never questioned the official explanations, the storage room was located in the basement level of Clarence House, accessible only through a series of security doors that required both keycard access and biometric scanning. As Thomas descended the narrow staircase, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the familiar scent of old paper and leather filled his nostrils. The room housed thousands of documents, carefully organized and preserved according to strict royal protocols. Finding the requested files should have been a simple task. But as Thomas began pulling the folders from their designated shelves, he noticed something that made him pause. Several files were misfiled, placed in sections where they clearly didn't belong. His methodical nature compelled him to reorganize them properly, a decision that would change everything. As he sorted through the documents, one particular folder caught his attention. Unlike the others, it bore no official royal seal or standard classification marking. Instead, it was bound with a simple red ribbon and labeled only with initials and dates spanning from 1997 to 2015. The handwriting on the cover was elegant but unfamiliar, and something about its placement among the other files seemed intentional, as if it had been deliberately hidden in plain sight. Thomas hesitated before opening the folder. His training had instilled in him a deep respect for confidentiality and protocol, but his instincts as a former detective were telling him that this document was significant. The weight of the folder felt substantial in his hands, suggesting it contained far more than a few pages of routine correspondence. Inside, he discovered what appeared to be a comprehensive list of names, dates, and detailed notes written in the same elegant handwriting. The first page bore a title that made his blood run cold: Friends and Supporters of Diana, Princess of Wales, Status Updates and Recommended Actions. The list contained over 60 names, including several he recognized as former royal staff members who had worked closely with Princess Diana during her lifetime. Thomas felt his hands begin to tremble slightly as he read through the entries. Each name was accompanied by detailed notes about the individual's relationship with Diana, their current position within the royal household, and a status indicator. Some entries were marked with a simple checkmark and the word resolved, while others bore annotations suggesting ongoing monitoring or planned interventions. The implications of what he was reading began to sink in. This wasn't simply a list of Diana's friends and supporters. It appeared to be a systematic catalogue of people who had been identified for removal from royal service. The dates corresponded almost perfectly with the unexpected resignations and early retirements that had puzzled Thomas over the years. One entry in particular caught his attention: Margaret Thornton, who had served as Diana's personal secretary for 3 years before the princess's death. Thomas remembered Margaret well. She had been a devoted employee who often spoke fondly of her time working with Diana. According to the official records, Margaret had resigned in 2003 to pursue other opportunities. But the notation in this hidden file told a different story. It suggested that she had been systematically isolated within the household, given increasingly difficult assignments, and eventually pressured to resign through a series of carefully orchestrated incidents. As Thomas continued reading, he discovered that the list was not merely a passive record, but appeared to be an active operational document. Several entries contained detailed strategies for removing individuals from their positions without arousing suspicion. The methods described ranged from reassignment to less desirable roles, to the creation of interpersonal conflicts that would make their continued employment untenable. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Every detail had been carefully planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign. The author of the document had clearly understood the importance of maintaining plausible deniability, while systematically eliminating any significant trace of Diana's influence within the royal household. Thomas found himself thinking about the many colleagues he had watched leave over the years, people whose dedication to the royal family had been unquestionable, whose departure had seemed sudden and inexplicable. Now, seeing their names in this document, he began to understand the true nature of their exits. They hadn't left because of personal decisions or better opportunities elsewhere. They had been carefully maneuvered out of their positions as part of a broader strategy. The document also contained references to external individuals who had been close to Diana. Charity workers, friends from outside the royal circle, and even some journalists who had covered her work sympathetically were all mentioned. While the royal household couldn't directly control these external figures, the notes suggested various ways their influence could be minimized or countered. One section of the document focused specifically on preventing the formation of any memorial initiatives that might elevate Diana's status or create lasting institutional recognition of her contributions. Thomas read with growing horror as he discovered detailed plans for quietly discouraging or undermining various proposed tributes and commemorative projects that had been suggested by her former colleagues and friends. The meticulous nature of the planning was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the discovery. This wasn't the work of a single individual acting on personal grievances. It required institutional support and resources to implement effectively. The level of detail suggested access to personnel files, scheduling systems, and internal communications that would only be available to someone with significant authority within the royal household. As Thomas neared the end of the document, he found a section that made his stomach churn. It contained what appeared to be progress reports, documenting the successful removal of specific individuals and the impact of their departures on the overall goal of diminishing Diana's lasting influence within the royal institution. The tone was clinical and detached, treating human lives and careers as mere obstacles to be overcome. The final pages of the document were the most revealing. They contained what appeared to be correspondence between the document's author and other unnamed parties, discussing the ongoing nature of the operation and the need for continued vigilance. The dates on these communications extended well beyond Diana's death, suggesting that the effort to erase her influence had continued for years, perhaps even decades. Thomas realized that he was holding evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the royal household. The systematic nature of the operation, the resources required to implement it, and the institutional knowledge needed to execute it so effectively all pointed to the involvement of senior figures within the royal establishment. As he sat alone in the storage room, surrounded by thousands of other documents that suddenly seemed less important, Thomas faced a profound moral dilemma. His duty as a royal employee demanded absolute loyalty and discretion, but his conscience as a human being was telling him that this information was too important to remain hidden. The people whose names appeared in this document had been wronged, their careers destroyed based on nothing more than their association with a woman who had been beloved by millions. The sound of footsteps in the corridor above reminded Thomas that he was not supposed to be spending this much time in the storage room. He carefully photographed the most significant pages of the document with his personal phone, then returned the folder to its hiding place among the misfiled documents. His hands were shaking as he gathered the originally requested files and prepared to return upstairs. Walking back through the corridors of Clarence House, Thomas felt as though he was seeing the building with new eyes. The portraits of former royals lining the walls seemed to watch him with knowing expressions, and he found himself wondering how many other secrets were hidden within these walls. The weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he struggled to maintain his usual professional composure. Back in his office, Thomas attempted to focus on his regular duties, but his mind kept returning to the contents of that hidden file. The names and faces of former colleagues haunted him, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the royal household's operations. How many other injustices had been committed in the name of protecting the institution? How many loyal servants had been sacrificed to maintain a carefully constructed narrative? The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine meetings and administrative tasks, but Thomas felt fundamentally changed by his discovery. As evening approached and the building began to empty, he found himself alone with his thoughts and the terrible knowledge that burned inside him like a secret fire. He knew that his life would never be the same. that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. That night, as Thomas sat in his modest flat reviewing the photographs he had taken, he began to understand the full scope of what he had uncovered. This wasn't just about the removal of Diana's supporters from the royal household. It was about the systematic erasure of her legacy and the silencing of anyone who might seek to preserve her memory within the institution she had served. The decision of what to do with this information would define not only his future, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. Thomas Mitchell, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family, now found himself in possession of evidence that could shake the very foundations of the institution he had sworn to serve. The irony was not lost on him, but neither was the gravity of his responsibility to those who had been wronged, and to the truth itself. The sleepless nights that followed Thomas's discovery were filled with internal turmoil and careful planning. For 3 weeks he had carried the weight of his secret knowledge while maintaining his professional duties, but the burden was becoming unbearable. Every interaction with senior staff members left him wondering who might have been involved in the systematic purge of Diana's supporters, and every mention of the late princess in official contexts felt like a carefully sanitized version of history. Thomas had spent countless hours researching the names on the list, using his security clearance to access personnel records and cross-reference departure dates with the notations in the hidden document. What he discovered only strengthened his conviction that a grave injustice had been perpetrated. Many of the individuals who had been forced out had exemplary service records and had received glowing performance evaluations right up until their sudden resignations or early retirements. The pattern was unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Staff members who had worked closely with Diana and spoke positively about her humanitarian work found themselves gradually marginalized. Their access to important meetings was reduced. Their input on significant decisions was no longer sought, and they were often assigned to projects that seemed designed to isolate them from the mainstream operations of the household. Margaret Thornton's case was particularly heartbreaking when Thomas examined it in detail. Her personnel file showed a dedicated professional who had worked tirelessly to support Diana's charitable initiatives and had maintained many of the relationships that had been crucial to the princess's effectiveness. After Diana's death, Margaret had attempted to preserve some of these partnerships, believing they represented an important part of the royal family's legacy of service. According to the hidden document, this loyalty to Diana's memory had marked Margaret as a threat to the new direction that certain senior figures wanted to pursue. The notes described how her assignments were gradually shifted away from meaningful charitable work toward routine administrative tasks. When she had attempted to organize a modest memorial event for the anniversary of Diana's death, she found herself facing a series of bureaucratic obstacles that made the project impossible to complete. The document revealed that Margaret's growing frustration with these barriers had been carefully monitored and documented. When she had finally submitted a resignation letter, citing irreconcilable differences with the direction of the household's charitable work, it had been accepted with what the notes described as satisfactory resolution of a long-term concern. Thomas felt sick as he read about the deliberate destruction of Margaret's career and the careers of so many others. These were not faceless bureaucrats or political appointees. They were dedicated individuals who had committed their professional lives to serving the monarchy and supporting its charitable mission. Their only crime had been their association with a woman whose popularity and independent spirit had apparently been seen as a threat to certain elements within the royal establishment. As Thomas delved deeper into his research, he began to identify patterns that suggested the operation had been far more extensive than even the comprehensive list indicated. The systematic removal of Diana's supporters appeared to be just one aspect of a broader effort to reshape the royal household's culture and priorities. New appointments to senior positions consistently went to individuals with no prior connection to Diana's work, and many of the charitable initiatives she had championed were quietly discontinued or redirected. The sophistication of the operation extended beyond simple personnel changes. Thomas discovered evidence suggesting that the narrative around Diana's legacy had been carefully managed through strategic communications and selective emphasis on certain aspects of her life over others. The humanitarian work that had defined much of her public service was gradually de-emphasized in favor of more traditional royal activities that aligned better with established protocols. This revelation led Thomas to examine his own position within the household with new scrutiny. His role in security had kept him somewhat removed from the charitable and ceremonial aspects of royal work, which may have protected him from the systematic review that had claimed so many others. However, he realized that his discovery of the hidden document had placed him in an extremely vulnerable position. The weight of this realization prompted Thomas to take precautionary measures. He began keeping detailed records of his daily activities and interactions, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to dismiss or mischaracterize if questions about his conduct were raised. He also made copies of the photographs he had taken of the hidden document, storing them in multiple secure locations in case his access to the originals was somehow compromised. During this period, Thomas found himself observing his colleagues with new awareness. He began to notice subtle dynamics and unspoken hierarchies that had previously escaped his attention. Certain senior staff members wielded influence that seemed disproportionate to their official positions, while others who should have been central to important decisions appeared to be systematically excluded from key discussions. One evening, as Thomas was reviewing security protocols in his office, he overheard a conversation between two senior administrators in the adjacent conference room. The door was slightly ajar, and their voices carried clearly through the quiet building. What he heard made his blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears about the ongoing nature of the operation he had discovered. "The anniversary is approaching again," one voice said, "and we need to be particularly careful about any initiatives that might gain momentum. The public sentiment around that time of year can be unpredictable, and we cannot afford to have any unauthorized commemorative activities." "The media monitoring has been effective," the second voice replied. "Most of the potential problem sources have been neutralized, but there are still some external contacts who might attempt to organize something. The friends from the charity sector are the biggest concern." Thomas felt his heart racing as he realized they were discussing Diana's death anniversary and the ongoing efforts to control how it was commemorated. The clinical language and casual tone with which they discussed these matters revealed how normalized this level of control had become within certain circles of the royal household. "What about the new staff members?" the first voice asked. "Have they been properly briefed on the sensitivity of these issues?" "Yes, the orientation process now includes specific guidance on historical matters and appropriate responses to external inquiries. We've learned from past mistakes about assuming loyalty without proper preparation." The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on various aspects of what Thomas now understood to be an ongoing operation to manage and control Diana's legacy. They discussed monitoring social media for unauthorized tribute activities, coordinating with security services to track potential memorial events, and maintaining relationships with media contacts who could help shape public discourse around anniversary coverage. As the voices faded and Thomas heard the participants leaving the conference room, he sat in stunned silence, processing what he had just learned. This was not a historical conspiracy that had ended with the successful removal of Diana's supporters from the royal household. It was an active, ongoing operation that continued to this day. The implications were staggering and forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his workplace and his role within it. Over the following days, Thomas began to pay closer attention to the activities around Diana's upcoming death anniversary. He noticed increased security briefings that focused on managing public access to royal properties, enhanced monitoring of staff communications during sensitive periods, and what appeared to be coordinated messaging designed to redirect public attention toward other royal activities. The realization that he was working within an institution that was actively suppressing the memory of someone who had been genuinely beloved by millions of people created a profound crisis of conscience for Thomas. His entire career had been built on the belief that he was serving an institution that represented the best values of public service and dedication to the common good. Now he was confronted with evidence that this same institution was engaged in systematic deception and manipulation. The psychological toll of carrying this knowledge while continuing to perform his duties was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Thomas found himself second-guessing every instruction he received, wondering whether routine security measures were actually part of the broader campaign of control and suppression. The trust that had been fundamental to his ability to do his job effectively was eroding, replaced by suspicion and moral uncertainty. During this period of internal struggle, Thomas received an unexpected opportunity that would force him to make a crucial decision about how to proceed. A journalist who specialized in royal affairs had submitted a formal request for an interview regarding security protocols during anniversary commemorations. The request was routine and would normally have been handled through established media relations procedures, but Thomas recognized the reporter's name from his research into Diana's external supporters. Sarah Patterson had been one of the journalists who had covered Diana's charitable work extensively and had maintained relationships with many of the organizations the princess had supported. According to the hidden document, she had been identified as a potential source of sympathetic coverage that could help perpetuate Diana's influence beyond her death. The notes suggested that efforts had been made to limit her access to royal sources and to counter her reporting through alternative media channels. Thomas realized that this interview request presented him with a potential opportunity to begin addressing the injustices he had discovered, but it also represented an enormous personal risk. Any deviation from approved talking points would likely be noticed and investigated, potentially exposing his knowledge of the hidden document and placing him in serious jeopardy. As he prepared for the interview, Thomas carefully considered how he might provide Sarah Patterson with information that could help her understand the true scope of what had happened to Diana's supporters without directly compromising his own position. He developed a strategy of subtle hints and carefully chosen words that might prompt her to ask the right questions and pursue the right lines of inquiry. The interview took place in a formal conference room at Clarence House, with Thomas providing standard responses about security procedures and anniversary protocols. However, when Sarah asked about the high turnover rate among long-serving staff members in the years following Diana's death, Thomas saw his opportunity. "Staff changes are a natural part of any large organization," he replied carefully. "But I have noticed that many individuals with institutional knowledge about certain historical periods and relationships have moved on to other opportunities. Sometimes the most valuable perspectives are lost when experienced people decide that their particular expertise is no longer valued or needed." Sarah's expression indicated that she had caught the subtle implication of his words, and she pressed him gently for more specific information about which types of expertise had been lost. Thomas provided carefully crafted responses that highlighted the departure of staff members who had been involved in charitable initiatives and international relationship building, areas where Diana had been particularly active. "It's unfortunate when continuity is broken," he added at one point, "especially in areas where the royal family had established important partnerships and commitments. Sometimes institutional memory is the most valuable asset an organization has, and losing people who understand the history and context of certain relationships can have long-term consequences." By the end of the interview, Thomas felt cautiously optimistic that he had managed to plant seeds of inquiry without crossing any lines that would expose him to immediate retaliation. Sarah Patterson was an experienced journalist who would know how to follow up on the subtle hints he had provided, and her existing knowledge of Diana's work would help her understand the significance of what he had suggested. However, as Thomas watched Sarah leave the building, he also realized that he had committed himself to a course of action that would inevitably lead to greater risks and more difficult decisions. The interview had been just the first step in what would need to be a much larger effort to expose the truth about what had happened to Diana's supporters and the ongoing attempts to control her legacy. That evening, as Thomas reviewed his performance during the interview and considered his next moves, he received a message that would change everything once again. His supervisor had scheduled a meeting for the following morning to discuss his recent activities and performance. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, and Thomas realized that his carefully calculated risks might have been noticed after all. The meeting with his supervisor, Deputy Security Director James Crawford, was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp in Crawford's private office on the 3rd floor of Clarence House. Thomas arrived precisely on time, having spent the early morning hours preparing for what he suspected might be a confrontational encounter. His 23 years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when routine meetings were anything but routine, and everything about this summons suggested serious concerns about his conduct. Crawford was a 15-year veteran of the royal household who had risen through the ranks by demonstrating unwavering loyalty and an instinct for anticipating potential problems before they became actual crises. His office reflected his methodical personality, with everything arranged in perfect order and multiple filing systems that allowed him to access any piece of information within seconds. As Thomas entered the room, he noticed that Crawford had several files open on his desk, a detail that confirmed his suspicions about the true nature of this meeting. "Thomas, please sit down," Crawford said without looking up from the documents he was reviewing. "I need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your recent activities and interactions with external parties." The directness of the opening statement told Thomas that his subtle attempt to guide Sarah Patterson's inquiries had indeed been noticed and analysed. He maintained his composure while preparing mentally for an interrogation that would test every aspect of his professional training and personal integrity. "I want you to understand," Crawford continued, "that we have comprehensive monitoring systems in place that track all interactions between royal household staff and media representatives. Every conversation is recorded and reviewed for potential security concerns and compliance with established communication protocols." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that his carefully crafted hints during the interview had been captured and scrutinized by people who understood exactly what he had been attempting to accomplish. The sophisticated nature of the monitoring system also suggested that his discovery in the storage room might not have been as unnoticed as he had believed. "Your interview with Sarah Patterson yesterday contained several statements that deviated from approved talking points," Crawford said, finally looking directly at Thomas. More concerning, your comments seem designed to encourage further investigation into areas that are considered sensitive from a security perspective.
I was simply providing factual information about staff turnover and organizational changes, Thomas replied carefully.
Nothing I said violated any specific protocols or revealed classified information. Crawford leaned back in his chair and studied Thomas with the calculating expression of someone who had conducted many similar confrontations. The issue isn't necessarily what you said, but what you appeared to be trying to accomplish through your choice of words and emphasis. We have analysts who specialize in detecting subtle communication patterns, and their assessment suggests that you are attempting to guide the journalist towards specific lines of inquiry. The revelation that his communication had been analyzed by specialists trained in detecting subtle manipulation tactics made Thomas realize that he had seriously underestimated the sophistication of the monitoring and control systems within the royal household. If such resources were routinely deployed to analyze staff interactions with media representatives, it suggested a level of internal surveillance that would make any resistance extremely difficult to organize or maintain. I need to ask you directly, Crawford continued, whether you have discovered or been provided with any information that might have influenced your approach to that interview. Have you come across any documents, communications, or other materials that relate to historical personnel decisions or policy changes within the royal household? The question was so specific that Thomas realized his activities in the storage room had likely been detected through some form of monitoring system he had been unaware of. Perhaps the access logs for the secure areas were more comprehensive than he had assumed. Or maybe there were surveillance systems that tracked not just who entered restricted areas, but also what they accessed while inside.
My duties require me to review various documents and files as part of routine operations, Thomas said, choosing his words very carefully.
I take my responsibilities for maintaining confidentiality very seriously, and I would never compromise sensitive information or use my position inappropriately. Crawford opened one of the files on his desk and began reading from what appeared to be a detailed log of Thomas's recent activities. 3 weeks ago, you spent 47 minutes in storage room B7, significantly longer than required for the file retrieval task you had been assigned. Security cameras show you examining documents that were not part of your original mandate. The specificity of the information made Thomas's stomach sink as he realized that his every movement within the royal household was being tracked and recorded, with precision that bordered on paranoia. The 47-minute time frame was accurate down to the minute, which meant that sophisticated systems were monitoring not just access to restricted areas, but the duration and nature of activities within those spaces. During that extended period in the storage room, Crawford continued, you were observed photographing documents with your personal mobile device, an action that represents a serious violation of security protocols and confidentiality agreements. Those photographs have been recovered and analyzed, and we are fully aware of the nature of the information you accessed. The revelation that they had somehow obtained the photographs from his personal device was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire confrontation. Thomas had believed that his personal phone was beyond the reach of royal household monitoring systems, but clearly the security apparatus was far more sophisticated and intrusive than he had imagined. The document you discovered and photographed, Crawford said, contains information that was classified for reasons of institutional security and personal privacy. The individuals mentioned in that document were subject to legitimate administrative decisions based on performance evaluations, organizational restructuring, and strategic planning initiatives. Thomas realized that Crawford was providing him with the official narrative that would be used to justify the systematic removal of Diana's supporters, a carefully constructed explanation that transformed deliberate persecution into routine administrative actions. The clinical language and bureaucratic framing were designed to make the conspiracy seem like normal organizational management. However, Crawford continued, your unauthorized access to this information and your apparent attempt to share it with external parties represents a fundamental breach of trust that cannot be overlooked or minimized. The security of the royal household depends on absolute discretion and loyalty from all staff members. The conversation had reached the point where Thomas needed to make a crucial decision about how to respond. He could attempt to maintain his innocence and hope that they lacked sufficient evidence to take serious action against him, or he could acknowledge what he had done and try to negotiate some form of resolution that might allow him to preserve his position and continue working toward justice for Diana's supporters. I understand your concerns, Thomas said finally, but I also believe that the information in that document reveals actions that were taken against loyal staff members for reasons that had nothing to do with their job performance or professional conduct. People who dedicated their careers to serving the royal family were systematically targeted because of their association with Princess Diana. Crawford's expression hardened as Thomas's response confirmed that he understood the full implications of what he had discovered and was prepared to challenge the official narrative. Your interpretation of those documents demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the complex considerations involved in personnel management at this level of government service, he said coldly. The decisions documented in that file were made by senior administrators with access to comprehensive information about individual performance, security clearances, and organizational needs. Your suggestion that these were motivated by personal or political considerations rather than legitimate administrative concerns is both inaccurate and deeply inappropriate. Thomas recognized that Crawford was delivering a carefully rehearsed response designed to shut down any discussion of the document's actual contents while establishing the official position that would be maintained regardless of any evidence to the contrary. The institutional machinery of denial and justification was already in motion, preparing to protect those responsible, while discrediting anyone who attempted to expose what had really happened. Furthermore, Crawford continued, your actions in photographing classified documents and attempting to share sensitive information with media representatives constitute serious violations that could result in criminal charges under the Official Secrets Act. The royal household has legal options available that extend far beyond simple employment consequences. The threat of criminal prosecution was clearly intended to intimidate Thomas into abandoning any plans for further disclosure, but it also confirmed the significance of what he had discovered. If the information was damaging enough to warrant threats of criminal action, it validated his belief that the conspiracy he had uncovered represented a genuine scandal that powerful people were desperate to keep hidden. I want to offer you an opportunity to resolve this situation in a way that protects both your future and the interests of the royal household, Crawford said, shifting to what appeared to be a prepared offer. If you agree to transfer all copies of the photographs to our security team and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, we can arrange for your resignation to be processed as a routine early retirement with full pension benefits and positive references. The offer was clearly designed to remove Thomas from his position while buying his silence through financial incentives and the threat of legal consequences if he refused to cooperate. It represented a standard approach to containing potential whistleblowers by providing them with enough benefits to make compliance seem reasonable while making the costs of resistance appear overwhelming. However, Crawford added ominously, if you choose not to accept this offer, you will face immediate termination for cause, loss of all pension benefits, and potential criminal prosecution for violations of the Official Secrets Act. Your reputation and career prospects will be permanently damaged, and your family will suffer the consequences of your poor decisions. The explicit threat against his family was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire confrontation, revealing the ruthless nature of the people he was dealing with, and their willingness to use any available leverage to protect their interests. Thomas realized that he was facing an adversary with virtually unlimited resources and a complete lack of moral constraints. As he sat in Crawford's office weighing his options and considering the implications of each possible response, Thomas understood that his discovery had placed him at the center of a conflict that was much larger than any individual career or personal consequence. The systematic suppression of Diana's legacy represented an attack on the fundamental values that the monarchy was supposed to represent, and someone needed to take a stand against the forces that were perverting the institution from within. I need time to consider your offer, Thomas said finally, knowing that this response would buy him a brief period to finalize his plans, while avoiding an immediate confrontation that he was not yet prepared to handle. Crawford nodded coldly. You have until tomorrow morning to provide your answer. I suggest you use that time wisely to consider the full implications of your situation and the limited options available to you. As Thomas left Crawford's office, he realized that the next 24 hours would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the exposure of one of the most significant scandals in modern royal history. The forces arrayed against him were powerful and ruthless, but the truth he carried was equally powerful, and he was beginning to understand that his responsibility extended far beyond his own personal interests. The 24 hours that Crawford had given Thomas to make his decision passed like a countdown to an explosion that would reshape the landscape of British royal history. Thomas spent the night in his modest flat, surrounded by copies of the evidence he had gathered and detailed notes about the systematic conspiracy he had uncovered. Sleep was impossible as he wrestled with the magnitude of the decision before him and the potential consequences for everyone involved. By dawn, Thomas had reached a conclusion that surprised even himself. Instead of choosing between Crawford's ultimatum options, he had developed a third path that would maximize the impact of his revelations, while providing some protection against the inevitable retaliation. His years of security training had taught him the importance of strategic thinking and careful preparation, skills that would serve him well in the battle he was about to begin. The first phase of his plan involved contacting several journalists simultaneously, including Sarah Patterson, but also extending to international media outlets that would be beyond the immediate reach of royal household influence. Thomas had spent hours researching which reporters had both the credibility to handle such a significant story and the institutional backing to withstand pressure from powerful interests seeking to suppress the truth. Using encrypted communication methods he had learned during his security training, Thomas began reaching out to his selected contacts with carefully crafted messages that provided enough detail to establish the legitimacy of his claims without revealing the full scope of his evidence until he could be certain of their commitment to pursuing the story. The international aspect was crucial because he understood that domestic British media outlets might be more susceptible to pressure or more likely to self-censor when dealing with royal scandals. Thomas also initiated contact with several of the individuals whose names appeared on the suppression list, people who had been forced from their positions and whose careers had been destroyed by the systematic conspiracy. Many of these former royal staff members had maintained their silence for years, believing that speaking out would only result in further retaliation and professional damage. However, Thomas hoped that the documentary evidence he possessed might provide them with the validation and protection they needed to finally tell their stories. The response from Margaret Thornton, Diana's former personal secretary, was particularly powerful when Thomas reached out to her through secure channels. After years of wondering whether she had somehow failed in her duties or misunderstood the expectations of her role, Margaret was both devastated and relieved to learn that her forced departure had been the result of a deliberate campaign rather than her own professional shortcomings. "I spent years questioning myself and wondering what I could have done differently," Margaret told Thomas during their carefully arranged meeting in a public location far from royal properties. "Knowing that it was orchestrated doesn't make the pain go away, but it does restore my sense of reality and self-worth. What they did to us was systematic and calculated, and it needs to be exposed." Margaret's willingness to speak publicly about her experiences provided Thomas with a crucial ally, who could offer first-hand testimony about how the conspiracy had operated in practice. Her detailed knowledge of the charitable relationships that Diana had built, and her direct experience of how those relationships had been deliberately severed after the princess's death, would be essential to establishing the full scope of the institutional betrayal. As Thomas continued building his coalition of sources and supporters, he became aware that his activities were being monitored more intensively than ever before. His phone calls were clearly being tracked, his movements were being followed, and he noticed unfamiliar individuals positioned near his flat and workplace in patterns consistent with surveillance operations. The royal household's security apparatus was preparing for his next move and positioning itself to respond aggressively to any attempt at disclosure. The morning of his deadline arrived with Thomas having made final preparations for what he knew would be an irreversible step into public conflict with one of the most powerful institutions in Britain. He had distributed copies of all his evidence to multiple secure locations and had arranged for automatic release of the information if he was unable to check in with his contacts according to predetermined schedules. The dead man's switch approach would ensure that silencing him would only accelerate and amplify the release of the information he had gathered. Thomas arrived at Crawford's office precisely on time, carrying a folder that contained his formal response to the ultimatum he had been given. Crawford was waiting with what appeared to be legal documents already prepared for either scenario, suggesting confidence that the combination of threats and incentives would be sufficient to secure Thomas's compliance. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider your situation and make a rational decision," Crawford said as Thomas took his seat across from the imposing desk. "The offer I made yesterday remains available, but only if you provide your complete cooperation immediately." Thomas placed his folder on the desk and looked directly into Crawford's eyes with a calm determination that seemed to surprise the Deputy Security Director. "I've given your offer careful consideration," he said evenly, "and I've decided that I cannot accept any arrangement that would require me to remain silent about what I've discovered." Crawford's expression hardened immediately as he realized that his carefully constructed pressure campaign had failed to achieve its objective. "That decision will have severe consequences that extend far beyond your own personal circumstances," he warned. "You are choosing to damage an institution that has served this country for centuries based on your misinterpretation of routine administrative decisions." "What I've discovered," Thomas replied firmly, "is evidence of a systematic conspiracy to erase the legacy of Princess Diana by destroying the careers of people who supported her work and maintained relationships that she had built. This wasn't routine administration. It was calculated persecution designed to reshape the royal household's priorities and eliminate any traces of her influence." The directness of Thomas's accusation seemed to catch Crawford off guard, as if he had not expected such a clear and uncompromising statement of the charges being leveled against the royal household. The careful euphemisms and bureaucratic language that had characterized their previous conversations were replaced by stark allegations that could not be easily dismissed or reframed. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, I have already begun sharing this information with journalists and other interested parties who are committed to investigating these matters thoroughly. Your threats and ultimatums are meaningless because the truth is already beyond your ability to contain or control. Crawford's face flushed with anger as he realized that the containment strategy had failed completely and that Thomas had outmaneuvered the security apparatus by acting decisively before the pressure campaign could achieve its intended effect. The revelation that media outlets were already investigating the story meant that damage control would now require a fundamentally different approach. "You have made a catastrophic mistake," Crawford said through gritted teeth. "The resources available to this institution for protecting its interests are virtually unlimited, and you have placed yourself and everyone you care about in extreme jeopardy. The legal consequences alone will destroy your life, and that is only the beginning of what you will face." The escalating nature of the threats confirmed for Thomas that he had made the right decision in refusing to be silenced. If the information he possessed was genuinely routine and unimportant, as Crawford had claimed, there would be no justification for such extreme measures to prevent its disclosure. The desperate tone of the threats validated the significance of what he had uncovered and strengthened his resolve to see the truth revealed regardless of personal consequences. Over the following weeks, as Thomas's evidence was analyzed and verified by multiple investigative teams, the scope of the conspiracy became even more shocking than his initial discoveries had suggested. The systematic removal of Diana's supporters had been coordinated with efforts to redirect charitable funds away from organizations she had championed, to cancel ongoing projects that bore her influence, and to actively discourage public commemorations of her humanitarian work. The international media attention that the story generated created pressure that even the royal household's sophisticated damage control apparatus could not effectively counter. Margaret Thornton and other former staff members provided detailed testimony about how they had been marginalized and eventually forced from their positions, offering compelling human stories that illustrated the real-world impact of the institutional conspiracy. Perhaps most damaging of all was the revelation that the suppression campaign had continued long after Diana's death, suggesting that the motivation was not simply about managing immediate political concerns, but rather about systematically rewriting history to minimize her lasting influence on the monarchy's direction and priorities. The public reaction to these revelations was immediate and intense, with widespread condemnation of the institutional betrayal and demands for accountability from those responsible for orchestrating the conspiracy. Opinion polls showed massive erosion of public trust in the royal household's leadership, and several senior figures were forced to resign as the scandal continued to expand. Thomas found himself at the center of a media firestorm that transformed him from an anonymous security professional into a public figure whose courage in exposing the truth was celebrated by millions of people around the world. However, the personal costs were exactly as severe as Crawford had predicted, with legal challenges, professional ostracism, and constant security concerns becoming permanent features of his daily existence. The investigation that followed Thomas's revelations ultimately led to a comprehensive review of royal household practices and the implementation of new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. While the individuals most directly responsible for the conspiracy managed to avoid criminal prosecution through careful legal positioning and institutional protection, their reputations were permanently damaged and their influence within the royal establishment was effectively eliminated. For Diana's former supporters who had been unjustly removed from their positions, the vindication provided by Thomas's evidence offered some measure of closure and validation, even though the years of career damage and personal suffering could never be fully remedied. Many of them chose to speak publicly about their experiences, adding their voices to a growing chorus demanding fundamental reforms in how the royal household operated. The legacy of Thomas Mitchell's courage in exposing the conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate scandal it created. His willingness to sacrifice his career and personal security to reveal the truth about Diana's treatment established a precedent that would make similar institutional betrayals much more difficult to execute in the future. The transparency and accountability that resulted from his revelations fundamentally changed the relationship between the royal household and the British public, creating new expectations for honesty and integrity that could not easily be reversed. In the years that followed, as the dust settled and the immediate furor subsided, Thomas reflected on the decision that had changed his life so dramatically. Despite the personal costs and ongoing challenges he faced, he remained convinced that exposing the truth had been not only the right choice, but the only choice consistent with his conscience and his duty to the people who had been wronged by the conspiracy. The systematic suppression of Diana's legacy had been intended to erase her influence and reshape the monarchy according to the preferences of powerful interests within the establishment. However, the exposure of this conspiracy ultimately had the opposite effect, creating a renewed appreciation for Diana's humanitarian values and ensuring that her memory would be protected by the vigilance of a public that had learned to question official narratives and demand accountability from those in positions of power. Thomas Mitchell's transformation from loyal security professional to courageous whistleblower demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when individuals with access to the truth were willing to risk everything to reveal it. His story became a testament to the importance of conscience over career, truth over convenience, and justice over institutional loyalty, inspiring others to speak out against abuses of power wherever they encountered them. The royal household that emerged from the scandal was fundamentally different from the one that had orchestrated the conspiracy against Diana's supporters, shaped by new oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements, and cultural changes that made similar betrayals much more difficult to execute. While the institution survived the crisis, it did so only by acknowledging the legitimacy of the criticisms and implementing reforms that honored the principles Diana had represented during her brief but transformative service to the monarchy and the nation.